Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. For those of you who I haven't met, my name's Hope, and I'm here every Wednesday at 1 talking about farming and gardening. And if you'd like to engage in this class at all, ask any questions or contribute any comments or ideas or thoughts, there's a chat box on the right side of your screen, and you can type right in there and add anything to the conversation that you would like to. So today is kind of a special day, and I think it's a special opportunity to talk about gardening and environmental health in general, because today is Earth Day. April 22nd every year is Earth Day, and this is actually the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So I thought that we could talk about it a little bit and get a little bit of an idea of where it came from and how it started and what results we saw from the first Earth Day and how that can inspire us today to be stewards of our earth and take good care of it. So, like I said, this is the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day, which was in 1970. And it marks the birth of the environmental movement. So this was the first day where people got together and demonstrated in the name of environmental health and well-being. So up until that time, in the decades leading up to 1970, the American media had been largely oblivious, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but largely oblivious to the environmental concerns of how a polluted environment was tied to human health. And up until that point, we weren't quite aware of the impacts of pollution on our health. We weren't quite aware of how industrialization in our countries, specifically in the United States, we didn't really understand how that was affecting our health yet. And the way I see it is this was kind of the dawn of recognizing the connection between our health and our planet's health. And I think that we are constantly evolving in that journey. I think there are lessons that each generation ends up learning about that connection between us and our planet. And at the time of the first Earth Day, that generation was kind of just discovering the connection between pollution and human health. And up until that point, factories had been polluting kind of unchecked. We didn't have as many laws that were protecting land and water and air. And Earth Day really changed that, and a big step actually toward the rise of public consciousness around environmental protection and human health and how they're combined. A big step toward that public awareness was the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which, if you haven't read, it's a really great environmental read, and it's very inspiring and eye-opening. And that was published in 1962, and it was published in 24 countries, and 500,000 copies. Yes, 500,000 copies were sold. And it raised an awareness for the well-being of living organisms besides humans. So it was kind of the dawn of thinking about other organisms besides ourselves. And it raised public concern for the connection between pollution and public health. So that was kind of setting the tone for the 1960s environmental movement. And it was growing during that decade. And it kind of came to a head in 1969 when there was an oil spill off the coast of Santa Monica, California. And that was kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back in getting people to rally together and set up Earth Day. So there were a collection of environmental activists who got together and started planning Earth Day. And one of them, one of the leaders of that kind of planning committee, was a senator from Wisconsin. So a person who was using their political influence to do something good. And originally it was set up as what they called a teach-in some college campuses and college classrooms. the goal of that approach was to kind of garner, from what I understand, it was to garner the fervor on college campuses against the war and apply that to climate change and what was going on with pollution and human health. And it ended up being a nationwide day of demonstration and protest. So what began as plans for a teach-in at a few colleges ended up spreading throughout the entire country. It bridged between political parties, it bridged between backgrounds and social position, and 20 million Americans participated. And by the end of 1970, we had the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, and we had new acts that we had never seen before that were protecting natural resources. So we had the Clean Air Act, we had the National Environmental Education Act, and that was just by the end of that year. So April was the first Earth Day, and by the end of 1970, we already had an agency that was focusing on environmental protection. And even today, that agency is definitely not perfect, but what mattered is that people were starting to pay attention. And 2 years later, we saw the Clean Water Act, and 3 years later, we saw the Endangered Species Protection Act. So that's aftermath of Earth Day. The first Earth Day is my favorite part of the story, because it reminds me that we can notice what's going on that is difficult to stomach and difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel for. But we do have the ability to create change and focus on what we can control. And that's inspiring to me because that makes me think of farming and gardening. So I'm sure you could see that coming. I'm going to transition this connection into farming and gardening, which is what we've been talking about during these episodes. So what I want to hold on to, the idea that I want to hold on to from the first Earth Day and what they accomplished there, is the connection between the earth and human health and public health. And what I really want to focus in on today is how that all applies to soil and how soil health really impacts human health and planetary health. So, like I said in the beginning, we're kind of constantly discovering these new reminders that we are totally tied to the health of our planet. And I think a really great way to demonstrate that connection is through soil. So a handful of healthy soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on the planet, which is crazy. So there's a lot of microlife going on in a handful of soil that we can't even see with our eye. There's a lot going on. And the issue is, as we'll talk about today, that not all of our soil is healthy anymore. So industrial agriculture and kind of aggressive agriculture practices have impacted how healthy our soil is. And it's actually been shown and said that there are 60 years of farmable soil left on the planet. And as farmable soil disappears, we begin to see more food scarcity and we begin to see more climate change. So we see more carbon in the atmosphere, we see more flooding, and we see more drought. And all of those are really they have to do with other things as well, but they're pretty directly tied to unhealthy soil that either can't retain water or can't retain nutrients, including carbon. So when soil is stripped of its life by, and we'll talk about all of these negative inputs as we go on, but when soil is stripped of its life and its biology and all of those microorganisms and those micronutrients that I mentioned in a handful of healthy soil, that soil can't produce healthy food anymore. So it can to a certain point still produce food, but it's, some of the food that we are buying today and seeing in grocery stores today might not be, and often aren't, as nutrient dense as food grown in healthy, thriving soil. So I think this is especially pertinent to people who are growing their own food or thinking about growing their own food this year or in the future, because we have control over the nutrient content of our food, because we have control over the soil that we grow it in. And I think I know I'm thinking about self-sufficiency during this public crisis right now, this public health crisis. And I'm thinking of ways that I can sustain myself and feel less reliant on a system that might not be able to supply for everybody. And I think a lot of this sounds kind of dire, and it is in a sense, but I think that people are waking up to this connection today, the connection between soil and human health, soil health and human health, in the same way that people in the beginning of the environmental activism movement were waking up to the connection between pollution and human health. So I see change coming, and I do have faith that that is happening, and we see that change beginning, and we see that connection between soil health and human health being recognized through the organic movement. So through people growing food organically and buying organic food. We see it through the regenerative movement, which we'll talk about today as well. So growing food in a way that regenerates the soil rather than depleting it. We see it in community farms, so farms that grow food locally and provide food to local families. And we see it in farm-based education, so gardeners. We're instilling, I believe, we're instilling kind of affinity to earth and a recognition from an early age that the earth needs to be taken care of, and it's not necessarily something to just take from. And finally, I think we see that that change is coming through gardening and through more and more people being interested in growing their own food. So that's my overview of that connection. So I think we can kind of just jump right into talking about soil health and what it is and how to recognize it and how to support it, whether that be in your garden or on a farm, or even supporting it through what you buy at the grocery store. So if you're not growing your own food, you can still vote with your dollar, as they say, and support what you believe we should be seeing more of in our agricultural system. Okay, so a little phrase that I like about soil health is it all boils down to the soils, which is a little bit cheesy, but I think it's still relevant. So like I said, healthy soil equals healthy food. So we can think about, rather than just feeding and sustaining the plants that we're trying to grow, we can think first about feeding and sustaining and supporting the soil that is growing those plants that we're hoping to grow. Because healthy soil equals nutrient-dense food. So the question that I think is the best to kind of start off with is, what does healthy soil look like? So some elements of healthy soil we can't see. So those 6 billion, 7 billion, however many billion number of microorganisms in a handful of healthy soil, we can't really see those with our eyes. But those are an indicator. There are these healthy, beneficial fungus networks called mycelium networks that are also pretty microscopic, but they are an indicator of healthy soil systems. And then there are various substances in the soil that kind of help with decomposition and nutrient transfer into plant roots. So there are all these microorganisms and these really tiny networks that are supporting healthy soil and thus healthy crops. But things we can see, if you think about picking up a handful of soil on a healthy, maybe organic, maybe no-till farm, it's going to be pretty rich in color. And that means that it's probably pretty rich in carbon. And it's going to be probably moist, even if it hasn't rained recently. You'll probably be able to feel the water that's being retained in the soil. And you might even be able to smell it. I think I conducted this little experiment with an old farming coworker of mine, where we took 2 handfuls soil, one from a bed that was producing a healthy crop, and one from the pathway that we were walking through in between the beds. So it was growing nothing and it wasn't being really cared for. Or, we were applying compost to the beds that were growing food, but we weren't attending to the dirt in the paths. And we would walk around to other coworkers and ask them to smell both handfuls of dirt and see if they could tell which had been taken from the bed and which had been taken from the path. And really, you could totally smell a difference. The dirt from the path didn't smell like much, but the soil from the bed had this like rich, pungent aroma that smelled like growth, and it smelled like healthy soil. So there are some ways that we can see healthy soil. Some of it's microscopic, but some of it is sensory. So it's the water, it's the color that we see, and the textures that we feel. If it's kind of clumpy and it's these like moist clumps of soil, that's a good indicator of soil health. That means that soil particles are being held together. And yeah, when we think of just like dirt from the park, maybe, or from land that hasn't really been managed intentionally, usually it's a little bit sandier. There's less moisture because it can contain less moisture. And it's mostly just dirt particle. There's not as much space for water and nutrients and those different microscopic networks. So that's kind of the overview of the healthy soil that we want to see in our gardens. The benefits of healthy soil are that it retains water more efficiently, and thus it requires water to grow. So healthy soil there's a balanced ratio between pore space, P-O-R-E, pore space for water and oxygen. And there's a balance between that pore space and soil particles. So there are just soil particles, and then there's room for water, there's room for oxygen, there's room for carbon, there's room for everything. And soil to hold on to water more. Healthy soil sequesters carbon from the atmosphere, which means that it takes atmospheric carbon, which is what leads to greenhouse gases and the pollution that we're worried about and the planet warming up, and it sequesters it into the soil, meaning it holds onto it in the soil, where that carbon actually does a lot of good in the soil, whereas it does a lot of harm in the atmosphere. And healthy soil, as we said, contains very abundant life. So the next question, I think, is how do we get there? So how do we, as gardeners or farmers, or just people who are interested in building a more resilient food system, how do we get to the point of having that healthy soil that leads to healthy food and healthier air, healthier water, and healthier communities? So the way that I've heard it explained, and the way that I really like to think about it as, is to think about our relationship with soil as a savings account. So when we are building up our soil with healthy inputs, which we will talk about those too. When we're building up our soil with healthy inputs, that's the equivalent of putting money into our savings account with the soil. And then when we are depleting the soil, and that can be anything from just growing a crop depletes the soil, even if we're doing it organically. It can mean tilling, it can mean chemicals, and we'll get to all of this as well. Depleting the soil, so a negative output, you could call it, is the equivalent to taking money out of the savings account. So what we're going for with our relationship with soil at the very base level is balance. So at the very lowest level of the sustainability, we would want to see at least equal input and output, at least equal money put and equal money taken out, when we're thinking about it in an analogy, in that savings account analogy. Ideally, we would see it as we'd be saving money. So each year that we step out into our garden or farm to get to work, we would be putting in more money than we're taking out. So every year the soil is healthier and healthier. And that's what we mean when we say regenerative agriculture. Those are management practices that lead to soil that's healthier every year. And it leads to soil that can hold more carbon from the atmosphere and thus impact planetary health. So right now, it doesn't seem that we have that balance. We, because of mostly industrial agriculture, we see that we are pretty much in debt to the land, and we've taken quite a bit more than we've put back in. So that's why I find it very exciting to be supporting locally, to be supporting like growers, and to be growing myself and helping other folks grow, because it seems that we can right that wrong and kind of tip those scales back into balance. So that leads me to, we should discuss what a healthy and an unhealthy input are, so that we can have an idea and have a better understanding of how to be putting more into that savings account with the soil versus taking out. So like I mentioned, unhealthy inputs include a number of things. The first things I think of are chemicals, which I think more and more small farms are moving away from, but industrial agriculture still puts so much money into spraying chemicals onto food, which creates this kind of cycle between disrupting organic matter and kind of canceling out organic matter in the interest of the kind of limited nutrient availability that's left over when chemicals are put into the equation. And then that thus depletes the diversity of the ecosystem, which then requires more fertilizer or more chemical. So it's kind of this circle that we end up getting caught in, and we're going around and around. There's monocropping, which we've kind of touched on in earlier episodes. Basically means planting the thing row after row after row, year after year after year after year. So New England, we're forced to give our land a little bit of a break, but in other parts of the country and the world, you can grow year round, and it's easy to not give your soil a break, to not allow it to rest, and to just keep planting the same thing over and over and over again if you don't have restrictions based on the seasons of what you can plant. So what comes to mind for me is cornfields, and they're kind of the crop that's been villainized for monocropping. But cornfields are one crop all the way through, and it's harvested just to be planted again. So we see very depleted soil and pretty unhealthy soil in those kind of systems. And in terms of rest, an example that I've heard before on a podcast about soil health and planetary health was about a woman. The story was told by a woman who was driving through the Italian countryside, and she saw a huge field of dead sunflowers. And they were there because the plant material was just decomposing and giving the land a break. And that's not something that you would really see driving through US countryside. We'd see monocropped fields always in use. And it's definitely a telltale sign when you drive past a farm that has some dead stuff growing in the ground or decomposing in the ground in the fall and spring, because it means that they are thinking about letting their land rest, and they're thinking about keeping something in the soil to be replenishing the nutrient content there, rather than pulling everything out and leaving the soil bare. So yeah, and then there's tilling. So tilling is using machinery to kind of dredge up the earth and kind of turn it over and over and over again, which really disrupts those microscopic systems that we've talked about, and it can lead to a big reduction in nutrient holding capacity, the ability to hold water. And another big kind of gripe that people might have with tilling is that it can lead to oxidation. So it aerates the soil, it's good, but it releases carbon from the soil into the atmosphere, which isn't great. And it ends up kind of reducing some of the diversity that you might find in your soil. I think tilling has gotten a pretty bad rep. It definitely has its place sometimes. There's practices that include minimal tilling or just primary tilling, which means you just till once in the beginning of the season to turn over your bed and pull out your cover crop and then get you ready for the season. But having a relationship with the land includes thinking about how often you're going to be disturbing its natural processes. And the great thing about healthy soil is that healthy soil usually means you have some earthworms under your soil, and earthworms are actually nature's tillers. So earthworms have been tilling the ground to an extent, not to the degree that a plow would, but earthworms have been tilling the earth for a long time. So we have these natural processes already in place that can help us um, think about ways that we can reduce our use of harmful or unhealthy inputs, which leads us to the light at the end of the tunnel and the positive side and the silver lining, which is there are a lot of healthy inputs that smaller farms and organic farms and regenerative farms and homesteaders and gardeners are already implementing and have been implementing for a while. So we see people composting, which supports that healthy ratio of space for water and then space for the soil particles. So composting leads to more diversity in microlife. It leads to more nutrient holding capacity. It leads to more water retention. And it leads to that rich, dark brown, lovely smelling soil that we all want to see in our gardens. There's crop rotation, which we've talked about in previous episodes. So, kind of the opposite of monocropping. It's switching whichever crops you are putting in the ground and replacing them in the next planting or next year with something different. So, if we plant corn every year in the same spot, it's going to deplete the same nutrients that corn tends to take up each year at the same rate. And then you might be deficient in a certain nutrient that corn took up. Whereas if you keep rotating your crops, you'll be putting certain things back in that earlier plants have taken out. And then that also just giving the land a rest. So letting it rest for a season, and that's built in for us in New England. But for folks who can grow all year round, it's still important to give your land a rest. So minimal tilling is a great way. Minimal or no tilling is a great way that people think we can replenish the health of our soil. Again, there are multiple schools of thought on that, but it seems like it's a good way to let the soil kind of do its thing without too much intervention. And then there are cover crops. So cover crops are a pretty direct way to replenish the soil. It feeds the microscopic organisms that we want and that lead to healthy soil. And when the cover crops are planted in the earth before the winter comes or before that rest for the land comes, it's still holding the roots of the cover crop. So for example, you might plant rye or oat, and this is not for harvesting, it's just for holding your soil in place so that it's not washed away by water or blown away by wind. It prevents erosion, but it also continues to put food into the soil of those microbes, which then can emit this sticky substance that holds the soil together and creates healthier clumps of soil in your garden. And it helps to kind of reboost that diversity that we want to see in our soil before the next season of planting. So those are just some of the ways, and that was kind of a quick rundown, but those are some of the ways that we can think about healthy inputs and unhealthy inputs right now. And from what I can see, it seems that our generation and the generations around this time before and after us are responsible for paying attention to this particular environmental lesson. And I'm glad that I had the chance to talk to you all on Earth Day, because it's an especially pertinent time to be thinking about how we can make a difference and how we can give back and tip the scales a little bit more in the planet's favor. So with that being said, I want to finish on a quote that I really enjoy, and I think it's not necessarily soil related, but I think it's excellent for Earth Day. And I saw this in a documentary. If your plan is for 1 year, plant rice. If your plan is for 10 years, plant trees. If your plan is for 100 years, educate children. So even if you don't have the ability to follow the regenerative agriculture outlines perfectly, even if your soil isn't at 100% health, doing what we can today is really important. And if we have kids at home or nieces and nephews or friends' kids, taking them to a farm and letting them put their hands in the dirt and showing them that that's where food comes from and showing them that the earth is worth taking care of is a really great environmental step. And it's a really great way to be an environmental activist. So with that being said, thanks for tuning in and learning about soil. Thanks for taking a little bit of time on Earth Day to sit with us at Newton Community Farm virtually and talk a little bit about ways that we can use our power as consumers and our power as growers and our power as a local community to do something positive. And before we go, I like to bring in at least something green to these little chats. So I'm going to show you a few basil sprouts. Here they are. They're pretty sizable. So these were actually leftover sprouts from Newton Community Farm, and the farm ops team at Newton Community Farm is prepping for our seedling sale, which is coming up in May. And these are the leftover basil sprouts. I took them home and I planted them in this little container. And today I'm actually going to take them out carefully so that their root systems can stay intact. And I'm going to transfer them each to their own container because, as you can see, they're getting pretty big and they're starting to overlap each other, which means that the basil plant that's being blocked from the light by this isn't getting the chance to grow as well. So it's time that they all get their own place. They all get their own apartment and they all get to be independent plants. So that's what's going on. These are about the size of some of the seedling sale basil sprouts that will be on sale through Newton Community Farms seedling sale in May. And the information on that, just want to make sure I get it right for you. We're going to be doing curbside pickup. So we're going to set designated times between May 16th and May 19th for folks to pick a time slot, come in and pick up their orders. The link is live right now for online orders for the seedling sale on the Newton Community Farm website. And you can find all the information on there. Ordering begins next week, right? April 27th to May 13th is when you can place your orders for the seedling sale. We're growing a lot, but we're hoping that it's going to go fast. So the earlier you can get online, the better, and you can fill out your order and set up your own time for pickup. And we're going to plan to do it in a way that's safe for everybody and in a way that gets everybody's plants into their hands in time to get them into the ground. So just to reiterate, on April 27th, we're going to start taking orders. The link to do so is live on our website, so that's newtoncommunityfarm.org. And pickup dates are from May 16th to May 19th. And they'll be curbside and they'll be safe, and we'll be able to take one more step in the direction of a healthy planet by supporting local agriculture. Okay, that's it for me today. Thanks again for tuning in. This was really fun. I'm glad we got to talk about the planet on Earth Day. Please tune in on Friday if you have kids at home, or if you would like a soothing story read to you by our very own Sue. She'll be reading on Friday at 1 p.m. So tune in for that. And then next Monday at 1, we're back again with Jay live with cooking. So take care of yourselves. Start thinking about what you plant in your garden, and keep visiting us here on YouTube. All right, everybody. Thanks. See you next time.